Good morning, everyone, and welcome you all in this Hansraj College E-Samvaad Kendra. I, Dr. Bal Krishan Negi, Department of Economics, will be talking about the economic reform and growth, different pattern and institutions. India-China comparison. As we all know, the relevance of topic is that the India is lagging in terms of manufacturing sector. That China, since its economic reform, the GDP contribution of manufacturing and the employment has tremendously increased because of growth in manufacturing sector, but not happening so in India. Today, we will talk about what the pattern China has adopted since its economic reform and what is the difference between the Chinese reform and India's reform. So it's the relevance for the India because the India is trying best to increase the contribution of manufacturing in GDP as well as the employment generation. As we know that India is in the top in terms of demographic dividend, if India really wants to reap the fruits of that demographic dividend, India needs to skill its labor force, not only skilling the labor force, but India has to provide appropriate employment opportunity to its growing demographic dividend. So before making the policies related to growth, employment, and inequality, we need to go back to the history, that some lesson that we need to learn from the history. So in that perspective, India is trying their best to increase, to generate more employment and to increase the contribution of manufacturing sector in GDP. As we know that the GDP contribution of manufacturing sector is very low in India, near about 14%, as compared to China, more than 30%. So today we will see what the China, since its economic reform, the policy has adopted by the China and how China has grown during the 80s and 90s. And fortunately, during that period, China reaped the demographic dividend which they have during 90s. And the India right now has the demographic dividend what China has during the 90s. So India, if India want to be the most growing economy in the world, we need to reap the demographic dividend by focusing towards skilling of the labor force as well as simultaneously creating the employment opportunity for all these demographic dividend, right? So we will see how China's reform was different than the India's reform, and how China was success to achieve the high economic growth during its initial period of the reform. So, reform in China and its impact on Chinese economy, that we need to see how China's reform was different than India's reform. Although China had started a reform much earlier in 1978 as compared to India, India has started since 1991. The China's reform was rooted in the rooted means that started from the agriculture sector. As we know that most of the people depends, most of the population depends on agriculture sector. If agriculture reform will be there, this will have the positive impact on the rural industrialization, and that is most important for India. What India right now in the stage of the transformation, because in India most of the people are living in rural area. So if we will be focused on the agricultural reform, it will have the positive impact on rural industrialization. So it has, China's economic reform was started from its agriculture sector. That is what is we have the first reform that was started from the agriculture sector. Before the reform, there was the commune system. The private ownership right was not there. The incentive was not there to farmers to produce more. Because of the reform, the ownership right has been given to farmers. This has incentivized farmers to shift the land use pattern from the low value to high value crops. That is, high procurement price along with the incentive to produce more than what required for fulfill contract with the state led immediately increase in agriculture growth from 2.7% in 1970 to 78 to 7.1% in 1974, 1979, 84. It means that because of the property rights given to the farmers, that they started, the producing more. That the agriculture growth has tremendously increased from 19 since its reform to 1984. So this reform led them to shift from the low value crops to the high value crops, because now they have the ownership right. If they are getting the better value of their output, they will produce more. That was the incentives given to the farmers, and resulting that agriculture growth has increased during the first initial period of the reform. The reform in non-agriculture sector. So China's reform simultaneously started from agriculture to even in other non-agriculture sector. So again here the ownership right has been given to commercial enterprises to take the decisions and all that. The industrialization was started from the towns and village enterprises that was locally run, the just like in India, the small scale industries. That that rural industrialization was supported by these towns and village enterprises, and this town and village enterprises was supported by the agriculture reforms. It means that the agriculture, because of the agriculture reform, that the farmers' income has increased, and resulting this has provided the support to the towns and village enterprises to grow over the time, and resulting that we can see that the GDP share of these towns and village enterprises in the first initial period of reform has tremendously increased because of this, towns and village enterprises, the reforms done by the China, that is started from the agriculture. Agriculture has supported the towns and village enterprises because the farmers' income has increased, and they demanded more the consumer goods from those towns and village enterprises. And then after 1980s, 90s, because of competition and the private entering of private players, there is many opportunity increase the opportunity to corruptions and manipulation in the TVS. But initially the TVES, towns and village enterprises played a major role for the rural industrialization. This has boosted the employment as well as the contribution of manufacturing sector in GDP in the China. And reforms in the state-owned enterprises. So even the government initiated, the Chinese government initiated reforms in state-owned enterprises through contract-based responsibilities and incentives to the managers, like household responsibility in agriculture, and given more autonomy in decision making. So this is what is the reforms in state-owned and big enterprises that has initiated in China. More autonomy has given to these state-owned enterprises, and most importantly, that the managerial responsibility based on the performance that is given to the managers, that if you are performing in a better way, you will be upgraded, uh, you will be promoted. So this kind of that incentives has been given to the managers, apart from the autonomy to take the decisions. All these reforms led to increase in productivity. This is what is the study of Grove et al. In 1995. All these reforms, which has been initiated in state-owned enterprises, has boosted the productivity in China during the 80s, 90s, resulting their manufacturing contribution in employment, as well as the GDP has increased. Okay, so reform and industrial growth in China. Now, because of because of reform, how industry has grown. This is what is we have: growth in industrial output and total factor productivity. Industrial output growth was 9.3% in 1978-93, increased to 11% in 1993-2004. Total factor productivity growth was 3.1% and grew twice in the second period. Output gain, not the value addition, both in China and India in manufacturing, where a large amount of manufacturing is assembling and processing materials and components. Value addition in Taiwan and South Korea was higher than China in first 25 years since growth started. So FDI and export contributed the employment expansion, technological upgrading, and disciplining inefficient enterprises besides the domestic consumption and investment, which led to growth of GDP. Net export contributed to 15% of real GDP growth from 2002 to 2007. So this is what is, China initially started reforms and, producing the labor intensive product. Resulting, China has created the more employment. Now, over the time, China is shifting from the labor intensive to the capital and technology intensive products. So in that way, the question arises: what will be the future of the China related to the sustainable employment? China will be able to create more employment because China is moving towards the labor intensive, the industrialization to towards the capital intensive industrialization. So initially, China has reaped its demographic dividend by focusing towards the labor intensive, the manufacturing sector, like toys, textile, shoes, etc., which is the highly labor intensive industries. And China has created employment, as well as the increased the manufacture output, manufacturing contribution in GDP. So now India has started the economic reform quite late as compared to the China. China has started in 1978, and India, after the economic crisis of 1990s, India has started its economic reform since 1991 by abolition of most licensing in industries, public sector de-reservation, disinvestment in public sector, foreign capital liberalization, trade liberalization, rationalization of tax, both direct as well as indirect tax reforms in financial sector to boost up the economic growth, because India has faced a severe crisis during the 1990s. Only option with India was to open up the economy with the macroeconomic reforms, macroeconomic stabilization, and India has took the action related to the economic reform across the sector. So now, impact of reform in India. So after the economic reform in India, how it has affected the Indian economy. So India's economic growth is mostly coming from the informal sector. all these reforms is this is what is we have the irony. All these reforms is related to the big corporates, but the most of the economic contribution is coming from the informal sector, though this is making a subcontract in informal sector. The reforms in formal sector has attracted more FDI, resulting we have more investment, employment generation, output production, and it has the impact, positive impact on the informal sector by subcontracting of products and all that. So India-China growth comparison. Now the point is India has started its economic reform since 1991, and India has much focused towards the product market, the different sectors. And if you see, the India's reforms has nothing much to do about the agriculture sector. Agriculture sector was ignored in reform process. So in China, they have started their economic reform from the agriculture to the industry. In manufacturing sector, contribution in the GDP has increased and employment as well. But it has not happened so in case of India. Still, India is trying their best to increase the contribution of manufacturing in GDP as well as the employment creation. So if this sector, the third one, the labor intensive sector is not growing, it means that the India is not creating much employment for its increasing labor force year after year. The point is here in this industrial group, because this is the labor intensive industry. And if India really wants to create, to generate more employment, India need to focus in these industries. Besides other, the technology driven, capital intensive industries, this industry should not be ignored, keeping in mind the labor market pattern in India. So reason for slow growth of labor-intensive manufacturing sector in India. Now the point is that why the China's labor-intensive sector is growing over that time, but not it is happening so in case of India. So what is the reason that need to be understood? The two policies, that is, most of the people are arguing that because of these policies, the manufacturing sector is not growing over the time. That is, the first is a reservation of large number of product for small scale industries. And second, the labor laws. These two were not found in China and Vietnam. The people are arguing that the reservation, the most of the product has reserved for the small scale industries. So small scale industries that is low productive and the productivity is low, resulting we have the manufacturing sector growth is low. And then labor laws which is hampering the industry, the manufacturing sector to grow up over the time because of the increasing labor cost due to these labor laws. So these are the two, the policies. People are arguing that these policies which is hampering the growth of manufacturing sector. So this is the argument, the reservation of the product under the small scales was the reason behind the low growth of the manufacturing sector. So the counter argument, the people are saying, oh, most of these manufacturing sector in China is in small sector, but the China is growing, but India is not. So, and then we have the labor laws and counter argument. So the people argues now, the most of the people argues that the labor law is behind the low growth of manufacturing sector. So some people argued because if reforms even before the stringent law and after the relaxation of law, there is nothing seems to be changed in the manufacturing sector growth. The Deshpande 2004 argued Indian labor market is not as inflexible as it is often is made out to be. Many firms are able to change employment as they wanted or increase the share of non-permanent workers. So the argument is that Indian labor market is most inflexible, not the flexible, which is hampering the the growth of the manufacturing sector. So these are the counter argument that Indian labor market not seems to be so inflexible. This is inflexible in book but not in the practical. The small scale industries, they are facing the problem because of the infrastructure problems like power and others, rather than the tininess is the reason behind the slow growth or low growth rate of the manufacturing sector. States with less competitive product market regulation and inflexible labor market regulation have experienced slower growth, particularly labor intensive industries. And other issues for low industrial growth in India. So some other, apart from these two policies, labor laws and the reservation of the product under small scale industries, some other reason behind the growth of slow industrial growth in India is well documented. That is, industrial concentration have not fallen over the time. The industry is concentrated in few areas, few region. Industrial concentration score of India is more than 3 times that of China. So product market regulation is much restrictive in India than in South Korea, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey. Peculiar industrial structure hampering the productivity effect of reforms dominated by extremely small enterprises, with 87% of manufacturing employment being in micro enterprises of fewer than 10 employees. So 87% of manufacturing employment is being in micro enterprise of fewer than 10 employees. So micro enterprise, so productivity, micro, only 87% of manufacturing employment is there in micro enterprises. So it means the manufacturing units, the tininess of the manufacturing units, resulting we have the low productivity in manufacturing sector. That is the reason behind the slow growth rate of the Indian manufacturing sector. Majumdar and Sarkar, the 2008, on the basis of NSS and ASI data 2000-2001, they come up with the evidence that 42% of all manufacturing employment in India was in firm with 6 to 9 workers. The informal, you can say informal manufacturing units, 6 to 9 workers. 1984-85, it was 40%. In firms employing 500 plus, it was 23% in 2000-2001. 1984-85, it was only it was 30%. It means that the size of manufacturing sector is small. Manufacturing sector unit is small. That is, manufacturing activities is generally happening in the informal sector, and that is increasing over the time. So their productivity is low, and their the output is also low. Wages are low. They are not getting incentive to grow up, and the argument is that why the tininess in Indian manufacturing, because of the labor laws. So that we need to have reform in labor laws, and in that way the government in 2020 has passed the new labor code, keeping in mind the reforms to do reforms in Indian manufacturing sector. To boost the growth of Indian manufacturing sector, government has uh, passed the new labor code in 2020. In farm employing 500 plus, it was, this is already we discussed. This now this suggests that this, the distribution, farm size distribution suggests the two things. That is first bipolar distribution with missing middle. Either we have the tiny units and either or we have the big one. The middle is missing. Middle means that the manufacturing unit which is implying which is employing the labor 100 or more than 100, near 100, 200 or 50 to 100. That is missing, hugely missing in case of India, and it is not in the Southeast Asian countries. The trade and deregulatory, second, the trade and deregulatory reforms uh, deregulatory reforms and the slowly declining small scale reservation have gone along with a decline, not a rise in the employment share of large farms. The productivity gap is larger in India as compared to others. Reason for low productivity in small farms: the infrastructure issue, credit, technology, competition from big MNCs, etc. Low level of education of workers and female labor force participation. So these are the some reasons, rather than the labor force. The people argues that why the productivity in small scale manufacturing unit is low. That is because they are facing the problem related to infrastructure issues, credit, technology, competition from big MNCs, and the most importantly, the workers, the education, lack of skill, and the most important that the the female labor force participation, the low female labor force participation in India as compared to the China. So, in conclusion, how China's reform was different than India. So now in the conclusion, we need to, if we have to develop a good policy, a better policy for growth and employment, we need to go back to the history and we need to learn something. We need to learn the lesson, something which has been happened across the country. So if you see back to 1990s, the Chinese reform, how China reforms was different as compared to India, and China reaped its demographic dividend during the 1990s through and this demographic dividend was supported by the economic reform. China was able to reap the able to grow uh, in terms of economic growth, as well as to increase the contribution of manufacturing in GDP and employment as well, and to generate the employment during the 1990s. So if you compare the China's growth during the initial stage of the economic reform, how China was successful to create employment as well as to eliminate the poverty ratio during the first one decade of reform. But it was not happened so in case of India. So that is why the China's reform was something different than the India, and Chinese reform was much successful to increase the economic growth as well as to generate the employment during the 90s and 2000s. So that is how the China's reform was different than the India. The experimental approach the China was adopted. Experimental, they have started reforms at the local level. If they success in that local level, and they have implemented at the higher level, at the national level. Successful decentralization of economic decision making and the fiscal power. That is again much better in China as compared to the India. So decentralization again plays a major role in economic growth of the country. And third, that the career incentive has been given to the managers the state-owned enterprise managers and the towns and village enterprises managers and that incentive has worked well in terms of increasing contribution of manufacturing in China's economic growth. So currently, even in case of India, uh, we know that most of the population is living in rural area, and the unemployment rate in India is much higher. So we need to be focused, and even the distress migration in India is increasing over that time. So we need to be focused in rural area to boost the the small and micro enterprises. We India needs to support small and micro enterprises, as well as India needs uh, to generate the non-farm employment for the rural population, so that it one way it will increase the income of the farmer, and other way they will get the benefit from these especially we need to be focused on agro processing industrialization in rural area. So one way they will be able to create that industry will able to create employment, and other way they will provide a good price to the produce of the farmers. So this is what is the difference of and this agriculture sector was much emphasized in China during its reform period, but it has not happened so in case of India. So if India really wants to reap the fruits of demographic dividend, we need to be focused on manufacturing sector. Thank you.